Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM Channel 141. This is the Insight segment. I'm Harold Fisher. Tonight, we have a fresh look at history through the eyes of an award-winning columnist and author. Michael Harriot is out with a new book titled Black AF History, the Unwhitewashed Story of America. And it is a real doozy. This book comes at a time when President Trump has criticized how much of U.S. history and museums are focused on slavery. We will get to hear Michael Harriot's perspective on what parts of history have been overlooked, sanitized, or just lied about, and why he says telling the full story truly matters. Michael Harriot, thank you so much for joining the conversation. It is an honor.
And thank you for having me.
Sure thing. I have to tell you, for those of you who are listening to the book on Audible, it's 15 hours and 40 minutes long. I will just be honest, I've only gotten through 4 hours of it, but it is amazing. The shade, the snark, the humor interwoven in the truth telling is amazing.
Well, thank you. As someone who isn't a regular consumer of audiobooks, my friends who listen to audiobooks, they always tell me it really matters who narrates the audiobook, and when the author narrates it, it's just a better audiobook. So I'm glad that I spent the time narrating it in basically a room the size of a closet for 2 weeks.
Yeah, how about that? Well, it is worthy of a read, but I also think that your interpretation really gives us not only insight into the book, but a bit of an insight into who you are. But let me start by asking you, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I think the thing that inspired me to write the book is, so I was homeschooled. I talk about it in the book, talk about being homeschooled. And so it wasn't until my children were learning in regular American education system that I realized how people learn about history and what people know and don't know about history. And I always find it, astounding what we know, what we learn, and how we learn it, right? So one of the examples that I use is, like, you learn about Thomas Jefferson being this great thinker and the writer of the Declaration of Independence when you're like in the 3rd grade. And right. Maybe when you're in the 11th grade, you might learn that he was a slave owner. You might learn about Sally Hemings. You might learn that he enslaved his children. But by that time, you've had 8 years of this dude was great. He's been deified for 8 years. And so it's hard to reckon with the real truth after you've learned what is unquestionably, when you were taught in the 3rd grade, just somebody's opinion, right? The idea that he was great, the idea that he was smart is really you being indoctrinated with a white idea, and then you not being entrusted with the truth, if at all, until you're almost an adult.
And you make such an important point, because even as I was thinking back on my junior high school history teacher, who was a Jewish guy who was prepared and informed about what we now know as whitewashing. Because we learned so much about American history, not just Black folks, not just the indigenous folks, even back then, there was so much that we covered in one semester that we didn't do a deep dive. And so when I am listening, for example, when you talk about the origins of Black folks in this country, you do a deep dive into pre-1619. No shade to Nicole Hannah-Jones, but I'm listening and I would have to stop and go back because I kept hearing in my head, I didn't know that. God, I didn't know that. And I think, so when I think about the I didn't know that, talk to me a little bit about the research that you did for this.
Yeah, the research was really the biggest part, just going back through the primary sources and, learning myself what people don't know. So what I did is I teamed up with a Black historian, and she was at the time the teaching at the University of North Carolina. Mm-hmm. But now she has left. It's Blair Kelly, who has a great book that came out called Black Folk. She has a number of books coming out, that are out. She's a Black historian. And so what we did is we sat down together, and what we imagined is, if you were going to teach a class on the history of Black people, and you had a certain number of weeks, what would the syllabus look like? And what would you cover? And then we created a syllabus, and then I researched every point in those syllabus. And, she would include things that, I didn't think about. Some of it we couldn't include in the book because it was so long. Like, there was a chapter that we did just on the history of mixed race people, right? Mm-hmm. And who was Black and who was white, like how, Thomas Jefferson's children became white. And so just that the process of uncovering all of this information and knowing that it's not necessarily hidden, but that it is just not taught, right? When they say, we hear sometimes like, Black folks don't know which part of Africa that they come from. That is certainly 100% not true, right? Like, they wrote down and told each other, hey, if you want the ones that'll grow rice, you got to go right here and get them from this place. And if you want the ones that know how to be blacksmiths, you have to go here. Mm-hmm. And you got to look in this tribe. So they knew where to go get us, and we knew where we were from.
Yeah. In the subtitle, it's called The Unwhitewashed Story of America. What do you mean by that?
Well, when you think about the story of America and what we learned in history, it's not necessarily, I didn't want to say it was hidden. I wanted to say it was just whitewashed, because it is whitewashed, right? Whitewashed partly because of a lack of critical thinking skills being taught in schools. So here's an example, right? We say Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, right? Mm-hmm. That's just the thing that we say. Everybody's taught that, right? Mm-hmm. And now we celebrate Juneteenth when, the day that the enslaved people were free. Well, Abraham Lincoln was dead on Juneteenth. Like, he was dead and buried in his grave on Juneteenth, right? So that story is unquestionably untrue, right? That Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't free the slaves. The enslaved people were freed by the 13th Amendment. And in my book, I posit the argument that Black people free themselves. But when we're taught these things, just without even thinking about them, like, this white guy freed the slaves and then he died, but then, the slaves were freed later. It's the part of the whitewashing of American history. When you teach people that slaves, we think of them and by default as their labor being stolen, but not the intellectual property. We not the idea that there was no European or American blacksmiths before they got African people to teach them. I go into a long deep dive about rice and how
Yes.
the original people, the white people, did not know how to grow stuff, right? And so we think of it as labor because that is part of the whitewashing, and not just the intellectual property, not just the scientific advancements in horticulture, in metallurgy, in science that we gave to this country.
One of the things that I was particularly struck by when you began to explain about chattel slavery and all of the things that were involved in it, the role of the Portuguese and Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, and all of those things, and those are very, very familiar names for those of us who paid attention in class, in history class. But the thing that I took away from it, and you do talk about this, and when you put it in modern perspective, I think a lot of people will really, really understand, is that essentially white people came to what is now known as America, settled, colonized, terrorized, whatever you want to call it, and they realized that they needed workers, so they decided to steal people in order to do that. And I guess the thing that is so fascinating to me, and I'd like your thought about that, what is it that would put into someone's mind that stealing people was okay?
I think that, when we think about different cultures, right? I think this is part of the human condition. Things that are not acceptable to us are acceptable to other people. So, for instance, in Africa, if you and I were part of two different kingdoms that, joined each other against each other, or butted up against each other, and we went to war, and I had prisoners of war, then you would become part of my society, and I would ingrain you into my society over time.
Right.
So to give a prisoner of war to a white man, you would have no idea that you could not conceive of this race-based, perpetual, intergenerational, never-ending lack of freedom, right? And that is part of the reason why we can't fathom what they did. Because you think about this, right? If you are part of a kingdom or a world where you eat certain animals, you can eat a cow, but you wouldn't eat a dog, right?
Mm-hmm.
You would think of a dog, the people who eat dogs, as savages.
Right.
Right? So to us, the people who would kidnap people and enslave them perpetually were savages, right? Like, we could not conceive of that. But, if you look at it economically, what it is they come from a culture of scarcity where that savageness is the only way to perpetuate their existence. And so, we could not conceive of it, but that's how European culture existed. It was a more warlike culture whose almost every technological advancement came through the study and the advancements of war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that does make sense. One of the things that also struck me in the book, and I heard that, I think, yesterday when I was listening, and you said true superiority does not require subjugation. Explain that.
Yeah, I think, when you think of white supremacy, when you think of all of these, constructs, these social constructs that govern societies, if you were truly superior in thought, in physicality, in lineage, then you would not have to subject anyone else to oppression. And we are often indoctrinated with the white supremacist construct of superiority in many ways that are sometimes subtle, that we don't even understand them, but they lend themselves to oppression, and they kind of justify that oppression. And the point is that, right, like, true superiority does not have to does not require oppression. And in part, one of the things that we see throughout history, one of the threads that leads throughout history, is the fear of blackness, which a superior person would not be afraid of blackness, and often it doesn't make sense. Like, we
Hold
would
that
be
point. Hold on, Michael. Hold that point, because I've got to take a really, really quick break. We want to remind our listeners that you can hear this in every edition of the Daily Drum Inside segment via podcast on WHUR.com. The Original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon is next on WHUR-FM. We continue this conversation on Sirius XM, channel 141, in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM channel 141. We continue our conversation with author Michael Harriot as we discuss his new book, Black AF History, the Unwhitewashed Story of America. Michael, before the break, you were talking about superiority, white supremacy, and subjugation. Please continue your point.
Right. Like, so, you would read Ida B. Wells making this argument, right? If keeping black folks in line required lynching to keep black men from, for instance, assaulting white women, right? Like, that's the only way you had to keep black men from assaulting white women and sexually attacking them. Well, why did y'all leave them on y'all plantations when y'all went to fight that war for white supremacy? Like, why weren't they violent then, right? Why were they so, violent prone, except when you left them on your plantation? Like, if black folks were really violent, right? If black folks were really dumb, why would you allow them to raise your children, right? Why would you leave them alone and have those black women nurse your children if they're violent, right? How could you leave your families along with them? Why would you have them drive your children to the market, right? And those are examples of some of they have created the ideas of inferiority that don't really make sense when you dissect them and look at them through critical thinking.
What do you believe are some of the biggest myths about American history that your book addresses? You've already spoken about Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves, but what else comes to mind?
I think that we talk about throughout the book is how black folks, we even think of it as like the systems that we dismantle, Jim Crow, the civil rights movement, how they were kind of a benevolent gift to black folks. Like, the progress that we achieved was because of white folks giving us a gift of being benevolent, or being, at best they'll say America was living up to its, responsibility or to its ideals. When at every turn it was things that black folks did to force this country. They had no choice, right? The big myth that America fought a war to end slavery is not true. When they asked Abraham Lincoln said, look, I just want to keep the Union together. If keeping the Union together means agreeing that slavery could always exist, That's cool with me, right? There is not a single document in history that says we're going to fight a war to end slavery. Ending slavery was a consequence of, and the only reason it was won was because black soldiers joined the Union forces. When you talk about the Civil Rights Movement, even until the day the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were signed, most white people in America still disagreed with the Civil Rights Movement. Not like 52%. I'm talking about 78% of white folks, right? So it is the movements that we founded, created, that forced this country to become what we know as a democracy. Like America coming to its center or living up to its promise. And I think that's one of the things that this book shows by investigating and interrogating some of the things that we thought we knew.
You know, one of the other things that I think for those of us who are fortunate enough to go to, for example, HBCUs as I did, or those who did not, but had, again, well-informed, well-taught history classes, when you talk about some of the deep dives into some of the great historical moments, like you talk about the Dred Scott decision, for example, you make a point of reading, quoting, the amendments to the Constitution, reminding the reader of what the Constitution said back then, as opposed to what it says now, and how those changes, were made through the evolution of this country and struggle. Why was it so important for you to include those kinds of details?
I think, there is a difference between, just working as a journalist, the difference between giving someone your opinion or a perspective and saying, oh no, look at what it says. I'm not interpreting this. All history is kind of an interpretation, right? But I wanted the readers to understand that this interpretation is based on historical documents. This is not what I think they said. Read it for yourself. Read these documents for yourself. See how it changed. Read what the founders said. Read what they wrote in the Constitution. Read how it changed. And read, when you condense it down and someone says, America was a racist country, it sounds accusatory. It sounds like a thing that you can debate, right? But when you say the founders at its inception says, yeah, but black people are half human. When you look at the Federalist Papers and you see them debating this, and it says, hey, our Constitution are both human and property, right? And This is how our Constitution will characterize not just enslaved people, but black people, right? Right? You don't have to get my interpretation of that. Once you read that the dude who wrote the Constitution said, yeah, but it's property too, right? When you read, the South Carolina Negro Act of 1740, that became the basis of how every colony and state governed enslaved people. When you read that there was no difference in how they treated the enslaved people and the free black people, you realize it wasn't economic basis or a social construct of slavery it was anti-blackness. It was white supremacy. They did not differentiate between free black people and enslaved black people, right? And so when I say I don't have to say America is a racist country. I can say, here is what the dude who wrote the Constitution said about race. Here is what the original states said about race. Here is what the founding fathers said about race. And you can judge for yourself.
And in this particular time in history and the politics that have consumed it, I'm sure that you realize the pearl clutching impact that your book was going to have on white people.
Right. I think I realized that, one, I don't think a book like this would be even necessary if white people knew history. Right. You think about the Black Studies movement, which, started in the late 60s, but became kind of universal in colleges in the late 70s. So most of the teachers that taught you and me had never learned Black history. And so when they, in colleges now, right, to become a social studies teacher, you just got to have a bachelor's degree. You don't even really have to take special history classes. And so we know how they teach Black histories, again, because the people who teach them never learned Black history. So we know that this country is governed by, our schools are filled with, governments are legislated by people who don't know anything about Black people, right? And so when they hear the truth that they've never heard before, they might think it is fake. They might think it is they think critical race theory is something that started like 5 years ago, right? They think that, I always ask, like, when people talk about, wokeness, hey, can you name a thing that is woke that Black people hadn't said 100 years ago? Just one thing that Black people, like, give me something that you think is woke, and I'll show you what Black people said the same thing 100 years ago that they're saying today that you call woke. And because they didn't hear the voices of Black people, because they didn't know the history of Black people, there's this movement to perpetuate the mythology, the fake mythology of America, where Thomas Jefferson, where Abraham Lincoln actually freed the slaves, where the slaves just had muscles and couldn't think, right? They love to perpetuate that, but we know the truth now, right? Like, no one is saying, like, you should take this interpretation of history versus another interpretation of history. What people are saying is, this is what the founding fathers said. This is what they wrote. This is what they did. This is what this country did at every turn regarding Black people. And if you want to erase that, you're erasing the truth, not anti-whiteness or critical race theory or wokeness, right? You are advocating for people to be dumber.
And I think you make such a fantastic point there, because again, the I don't know that moment that I had, another one was I knew that certainly the European settlers, colonizers, or what have you, I was aware of just how difficult it was once they got to what is now America. I mean, this was not, rolling up on the beach and building log cabins, and there was famine, there was disease. I think I knew, but you reminded me, because I had forgotten that, yes, there was cannibalism. Certainly there was, starvation, and there was a horror show. And as you know, there's the saying, whoever wins the war tells the story. And this book reminds me of who won the war, so to speak. But there are still people who have kind of the institutional memory, Black people and their descendants, who say, well, they may have won the war, but we are still fighting.
Right. I think that is, it is important. And at points in the book, some people might think that I'm making light of it, of their incompetence, because I repeatedly point out how incompetent at every turn
Mm-hmm.
who came to this country were. And I make jokes about it, but there's a very important thing to know about that, to understand about that, and not just with history, but as it relates to today. Like, so often as Black people, we'll hear that, white folks do this with their money. That's why they can keep getting. And when white folks go to school, they tell their children this. And the point is that they've had every social advantage. They ain't smarter, right? At every turn, historically, they've been the most incompetent class. They're not doing anything special. They got their wealth because they stole it, not because they were smart, right? They got their money because they had more guns, not because they were smart. They got their land because they enslaved people. And that's the thing that, I go into a deep dive about head rights, the idea that, the more enslaved people you brought to America, you got free land. Right? Every Black person you brought to America, you got 50 acres of free land. And it's important to talk about that because we think sometimes that, like, the work of the slaves and even the free, even if you're being generous, the free labor that the slaves gave them made them rich. And no, it was that they owned slaves, right? Being a enslaver made you rich. You didn't have to make a profit or anything. Just as long as you could bring slaves here, you would get free land. And in a world of finite resources, that generational wealth still exists to this day. And pointing out that incompetence, dissects and disparages the opinion that we have, like, white folks be doing stuff, or they have this social smarter. Nah, it was the oppression that did it, and not even the results of the oppression. It was that they were oppressors that gave them this.
You inject so much humor, and I would recommend to anyone who's listening right now, even if you're reading it, to make sure that you get the Audible book, because as I said in the beginning, it is there are nuances in your voice and your delivery that are missed, that you don't get when you read it. But why did you inject humor? Why do you think that was, important to, for the, the shade, or as I say in bourgeois, the shade, or the,
I think I wanted to write a book that communicated to the readers how Black people communicate with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And how we do, right? Mm-hmm. We could be at our grandmother's funeral, and if somebody walks in with the wrong outfit, like I was talking to my sister yesterday, and she was telling me that, she went to a mutual friend of ours' funeral, and our cousin was sitting next to her, our cousin who is a pastor, and he was just joking the entire funeral, had her cracking up. And that's how we communicate with each other, right? In part, that's how we deal with the pain and the trauma that this country has wrought upon us. But the thing is, I don't have to inject humor as a Black person. I just have to not take it out. We got the jokes, right? We kind of have to hold back to be serious if you're a journalist or in academia. You have to pretend to be serious to fit that template, that construct that academia or journalism or whatever field you in, politics, has created. But I didn't feel the need to do that when I'm communicating with people who understand how I talk. So I just didn't take it out. I thought the humor, and then the other thing is dealing with how traumatic history is. You are able to communicate more of the injustices if it is not as heavy because of the humor. If you can digest the humor alongside the trauma.
Who did you write the book for? And I ask this because it reminds me in some ways of the required reading that I had when I was in college. For example, The Souls of Black Folks or The Miseducation of the Negro. And I could see a humanities professor or a history professor, that first day of class, holding up your book and saying, this is the first thing that we are reading, short of, the Oduvaivai lecture, in the beginning of class. But most importantly, who is this book for?
I think I wrote it for me, but not Michael Harriot, 50-year-old Michael Harriot. I wrote it I remember when I was, 10, 11 years old, and I read Soul of the Robot. And after I read Soul of the Robot, I was looking for another book to read on my family's bookshelf, and I saw W.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folks, right? Like, it's got to be the same thing. Like, instead of robots, it got to be about black. Like, it must be. And reading that, gave me not just a perspective on history, because it's not really a book about history. It is a book about the existence of Black people. And I wrote Black AF history for that 10-year-old boy who might see the title and pull it off and let me see what this is about. I remember reading the same thing with Before the Mayflower, right? Mm-hmm. Right, by Lerone Bennett Jr. I remember there used to be a book. It's not even for sale now, but it used to be in all Black homes. The Black Book. I have like 4 copies now. Just thumbing through that and remembering that, like, you didn't have to read it from front to back. You could open it up at any page and learn something. Like, that's how I imagine this book, right? For that 10-year-old or that 12-year-old or that 15 or 18 who might not ever read a history book, but might dive into this because the title or the cover or the name looks interesting and then gets hooked. That's who I wrote it for. And I wanted to talk to them how I talk to Black people.
Through your research and writing, what was the thing that surprised you the most about what you learned?
I think what surprised me the most about what I learned is that how much of our history isn't hidden. It's just not taught, right? Like, a lot is, it would be one thing if I had to, travel to distant places and unearth this history. But a lot of this history is known, even if the stories aren't taught. And we just don't want to talk about them. We just don't want to confront that history. We just don't want to tell children and students about the history. Like, it's not hard to understand this country and to find out the truth about this country. It's hard to get schools and education systems to tell the truth. And that's what was the most surprising thing to me, was like, not hard to find out. It's just not taught.
Why do you suppose that is? I mean, and this is beyond we don't want white folks to feel bad about themselves. There's more to that. Why do you suppose that those powers that be, school boards or what have you, don't want to talk about the whole history, the horror show, because there's a lot of it, and the achievements and the struggle and the evolution of Black people in this country.
Directly controverts the mythology that we've been told, right? If you are a person who got 47 acres from their great grandfather, then how trumpet that hard work and education is all you need to survive? How can you call this a land of opportunity when there is a class of people who've never had the opportunity, right? One of the greatest examples of it is Shamari Figures, who is the newly elected congressman in the new district, the ungerrymandered district in Alabama, where he ran against a woman who kept saying like she is a real Alabamian. He moved to DC and became part of the DOJ, but she's a real, well, Shamari Figures' ancestors were enslaved in Alabama in the his father prosecuted the land, right? His parents were civil rights activists throughout his history, and his white lady was part of a rich family from Georgia who took their slaves, mortgaged their slaves, moved to Alabama, and started a ranch where she still lives on to this day. Now, you tell me, who is the real Alabamian? That's the thing that history upends. It undermines their narrative about their work and what they built, because we can find out who built it. And I think that is what that kind of resistance to truth is about.
Unfortunately, I am out of time. I could talk to you about this for another hour. The only thing that I really take exception to in the book is really the title. It's Black AF History. I think it should be Blackety Black AF History. And so if you decide to write a sequel, use Blackety Black AF. Just give me a little credit, in the beginning. Michael Harriot, it's just such a pleasure to talk to you. Congratulations on a fantastic book, and thank you for contributing to the educational progress, and for all of us, not just Black folks, but for all of us, because everyone needs to read this book.
Well, thank you for having me.
Sure thing. That is the Daily Drum for this Wednesday, September 3rd. I'm Harold Fisher.